Welcome to the Independent School Podcast with me, Juliet Corbett. This is the place where we get curious about leadership and strategy in schools. As a coach and consultant, I've worked with many school leaders and have been privileged to see behind the scenes of their daily work. Here, I'm able to share the ideas and the tips that I've developed over the years to help the leaders that I've worked with. And most importantly, how thinking and acting strategically can help you get more done and feel less exhausted at the end of each day. This week, we're going to be diving into the topic of strategy and well-being, and more precisely, whether or not having a school strategy is a help or a hindrance for staff and leader well-being. We're going to be diving into some of the academic evidence, just briefly, just to give an overview of what the academics tell us about this connection between strategy and well-being. And then I'm going to be sharing with you what I've seen over the last few years in particular, and the ways in which my thinking has been shifting and changing. And towards the end of this episode, I'm going to be sharing with you my new mission. My thoughts have been crystallizing around this topic over the last couple of months, and I'm going to become much more bold in explaining what I think we should be doing as schools and the direction I think we should be taking. So I'm going to be sharing that with you and getting your feedback on that as well. Okay, so let's first of all dive into the academic evidence. So there is a very strong evidence base to show that organisations with an organisational strategy outperform organisations without a strategy. Now, that is mostly research within the for-profit world. However, the research that has been done, which has looked at not-for-profit and public sector organisations, has demonstrated that we think that this finding does extend to those types of organisations as well. So I think we can strongly say that, having seen the academic evidence, it's a good idea to have a school strategy in place in order to help your school perform at its best, at its highest possible level. It's not too much of a leap to also think that underperformance or working within an underperforming school isn't generally conducive to strong leader well-being. Now, that's a little bit of a jump, and maybe, there are some people that really thrive within an underperforming organisation because they feel the mission to bring it up to its full potential. That's entirely possible. But generally speaking, leaders are going to feel more confident, less stressed, more able to have an impact when the organisation that they're working in is working to its best ability and performing at that level. So I think it's not too much of a leap of faith to say that we do find in the academic evidence that having a school strategy is beneficial to well-being. There's also evidence which shows that, looking at the kind of flipping the question the other way around, that shows that a lack of clear strategy is connected to higher levels of stress within organisations. So, for example, there are studies that show that where there's role ambiguity, which is an academic term for where leaders aren't really clear what they're being asked to deliver or the responsibilities that they hold to deliver those goals, in those situations there is higher levels of leader stress. And similarly, that in situations where there is a misalignment, so maybe there is a strategy in place, but it's not aligned to the reality that leaders actually find themselves in, that can lead to high levels of stress and lower levels of job satisfaction. So I think there's a pretty good evidence base to say that having a strategy is good for well-being. However, as I've talked about on this podcast before, not all strategy is the same. There are different forms that strategy can take. One of the things that I've talked about most frequently is the planned and emergent strategy spectrum. So really quick recap on what that is. If you imagine a spectrum from left to right, at one end of that spectrum is planned strategy. In a planned strategy environment, there is a very rigid strategy development process that takes place. There is then a very formalised and detailed strategic plan which is produced. And the role of leaders and staff is to just deliver that plan. It's very, very planned, very top-down, very rigid approach to strategy. At the other end of the spectrum is what's called emergent strategy. This is where strategy bubbles up across the organisation and is then implemented in a much more agile way. Things are fluid, there isn't a rigid plan, but there is the role of leaders is to conduct the orchestra, if you like, around the ideas that are emerging. Now, there is less direct evidence in the academic literature which looks at how well-being of leaders is connected in to that spectrum. So even though we can say that strategy is conducive to leader well-being, maybe there are differences that are as yet unexplored within the literature with regards to whether an overly planned strategy could potentially be quite detrimental to leader well-being, and whether or not a more emergent style of strategy allows leaders to have a bit more flexibility and is therefore more conducive to leader well-being. It's an open question in the literature. What we do have are a few little pointers to where the answer might lie. And actually one of the most evidence-based conclusions that's emerged from business research, from organisational research, we've known since about the 1980s, 1990s, there's a strong correlation between what's called role autonomy and stress levels. And basically what this means is that when staff and leaders are in positions where they have very little autonomy, very little control over their day-to-day work, they tend to experience higher levels of stress. And in those roles where there is more autonomy and control, the stress levels tend to decrease because people feel like they have more control over their working lives. Now that does point us in the direction of thinking that maybe an overly planned strategy could potentially reduce the autonomy and control that leaders feel because they're working within really strict, rigid plans that are developed within schools, often on a 3-year or a 5-year cycle of strategic planning, and it doesn't leave them with a lot of control over what they're trying to do in terms of the leadership role that they're playing within delivering that strategy, which could potentially be increasing the stress that those leaders are feeling. So the evidence is pointing us in one direction, but isn't entirely conducive. So let's have a little think about the way that we see this playing out in schools. So this is my hunch. My intuition has been telling me this over the last 7-8 years that I've been working with schools. So first of all, I've definitely seen that most schools have a fairly planned approach to strategy, and that if we look at the last couple of decades, that has been increasing over time. Now, it's possible, and I have seen some examples of this, that over the last couple of years, because of the COVID pandemic, we have moved to a slightly less planned approach to strategy, which is very welcome in my view. But generally speaking, if we look at ourselves as schools compared to, let's say, technology startups, who tend to be much more emergent in their approach to planning and their approach to strategy, schools are very, very planned in terms of their strategy. Now, my hunch, what I'm seeing is that this actually increases leader stress within our schools, and potentially even more than that, actually challenges mental health within our leadership. And although I'm talking about leaders, actually, because that's who I tend to work with, so that's why I can speak with a little bit more kind of authority and evidence-based of seeing lots of examples, I suspect the same is true for all staff in schools, actually, that an overly planned approach to strategy is leading to higher levels of stress and challenging mental health. Now, a few weeks ago, I talked about breaking my ankle and the enforced period of rest that then imposed upon me, and the fact that I was able to hear my intuition a little bit more strongly. So I have been suspecting for some time that in the school sector we must move away from the overly planned approach that we use for strategy at the moment, must move towards a more emergent, agile form of strategy. My intuition, as I was forced to sit in the garden for weeks at a time with my foot up and in a fair amount of pain, my intuition was telling me this is the direction I need to be talking about more. Not just because I believe that actually schools can perform better and therefore have a greater impact on their pupils, a greater impact on society if they're using a more emergent form of strategy, but also because I'm seeing some really stressed people. And this doesn't lead to people wanting to stay in the sector, people wanting to take second and third headships, really talented people who are thinking that maybe there's an alternative career path that would be less stressful and more rewarding for them. We don't want to see that. I think we need to shift the way we're thinking about strategy. So I want to share with you 4 big ideas. Now, I'm not going to be able to go into any of these ideas in a lot of detail because they're really quite big ideas. But 4 big ideas which I'm going to be bringing to the forefront of the work that I do and the podcast episodes that I'm recording in future, and that I want to get your feedback on. Okay, so the first of these big 4 ideas, we have to adopt a strategy as learning approach. This is my way of talking about agile, emergent strategy. I really don't want to be seeing any more schools creating 5-year plans. I think a 3-year plan is probably the most that we want to be creating. And even better than that, let's ditch the strategic plan, potentially, in some cases. Let's have a shared vision and then an annual action plan, which is absolutely based in strategy, but which isn't constrained by a 3-year strategic plan. Now, I'm very open to comments on this, and I probably will be working with schools on 3-year plans, but I think that we can change our mindset around what those plans are creating. It's not creating a rigid structure, it's creating a feeling of heading in the right direction. And one of the things that people talk about in agile strategy is a strategy sprint. This is the idea of having maybe a 6-week or 9-week focused period of time where an organisation sprints towards a very specific strategic goal. And then there's a pause, there's a rest and a regrouping before they then conduct the next sprint. Now, we do this naturally in schools because we have terms. We have a termly or semester structure. And in doing that, we naturally are sprinters within our school year. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from that as well. I talked about this fairly recently on my strategy as learning episode, which I'm going to put the link to in the episode notes if you want to hear more. But this is big idea number 1. We have to embrace that strategy is a learning process. Big idea number 2. Strategic thinking is more important than a strategic plan. I have been saying this, I don't know how many years, many years. I'm not sure that people have really heard me, so I'm going to say it louder in future. Strategic thinking is what allows us at all levels of our school, every single member of staff in our school, by thinking and acting strategically in the moment, that's what actually allows us to deliver our big vision. The plan, the strategic plan, is just a communications tool. That's all it is. And so I think we need to de-emphasize the strategic plan and really focus in on talking about strategic thinking much more. And I've talked about that on many episodes before, and I will be talking about that again in future episodes as well. I have a particular episode around defining the 5 elements of strategic thinking, which I will put a link to in the episode notes from this episode. Okay, big idea number 3, focus and simplicity. If we're going to be talking about a less planned approach, we're probably also talking about a simpler approach to strategy. And when I talk about strategy, I often talk about it as almost the same as focus. Strategy is about deciding where to focus your scarce resources in order to overcome the biggest challenges that you face. Given that, we really need to be actually, in reality, not just talking about, in reality, focusing our efforts and building more simplicity into our operations. And that means stopping doing some things. It means saying no to some new ideas. It means taking tough decisions. But that's what we need to be doing. We need to be more focused and we need to be building in more simplicity in order to deliver more in terms of getting towards our vision faster. It might not surprise you, I did an episode recently on simplicity in strategy, and I'm going to link to that in the notes as well. Big idea number 4, empowerment and the responsibility held by senior and middle leaders. One of the things that I see quite frequently is high levels of stress within heads and that senior leadership team, the kind of executive high level senior leadership team, because of various different blockers that are preventing them, for various different very good reasons, are preventing them from really empowering the rest of the leadership team and middle leaders to actually think and act strategically on their own, to empower them and for them to take responsibility to deliver parts of those strategic sprints that I talked about before. And I think this is another big area that I'm going to be talking about more. It's really important that strategy is not just something that happens with the head and the executive leadership team and the governors. This is something which needs to be owned by everybody in the school, and particularly middle and senior leaders. So empowerment and the responsibility that comes alongside that is my 4th big idea. Now I'm going to be talking about all these ideas more over coming episodes. What I'd love to do is I want to get your feedback. So in my eyes, in my mind, I want to develop a new language to talk about these things. And the thing that keeps coming into my mind is the idea of strategy held lightly, or the idea of light strategy. I haven't quite refined my thinking around this, but there's something around having a lightness rather than in the contrast, the heaviness of the strategic plans, the strict planning, the rigid KPIs, the rigid reporting structures. That all feels really heavy. And in contrast, I want to create an idea of strategy held lightly. The words that come to mind here are the space to breathe, the time to learn, and the courage to adapt. This is what I think we need in schools. I think we need to build in this idea that strategy isn't a heavy thing that's done to us or that we do once a year. Strategy is something that creates space to breathe, time to learn, and the courage to adapt. So that's my new mission, is to talk about these big 4 ideas and to talk about this lightness of strategy that I really want to encourage schools to develop. So my question to you is, I want you to be able to help me in this new mission. So first of all, do these ideas resonate with you at all? I need to hear from you because I want to know that I'm heading in the right direction with the podcast. And if the ideas resonate, what about the words that I'm using? Do they feel like the right kind of language, the right kind of words to be using in this context? And then a third question. So firstly, does the idea resonate? Do the words resonate? Third question, what are the blockers that are going to prevent us as a sector or as your individual school from heading in this direction? If this sounds good and you're thinking, sounds great, Juliet, but what about this big blocker that I can see that's going to prevent me from moving in this direction? I'd love to know what you think those are. I've got lots of ideas about what I think those blockers are, but I want to hear your thoughts and ideas as well. In my work as a leadership coach has informed all of these insights. The fact that I have the opportunity and the privilege to work with senior leaders and heads within schools, and actually also with organisations that are wider within the education sector, has given me the insights to make this tweak in the direction that I'm taking. And if you want to have the opportunity to explore how I might help you generate insights in your work as a leadership coach, then just reach out to me, get in touch, and let's chat. So that's it for this week. I hope that this has been helpful. And if it has, please do share this episode with a friend or a colleague. And you can also sign up for my mailing list as well if you want to get emails each Thursday morning to let you know what the podcast episode is this week. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I hope this week you'll have the space to breathe, the time to learn, and the courage to adapt. See you next time. Bye-bye.